I was forgotten in the hospital, but when the lawyer called, everyone wanted to visit me. My hospitalization was supposed to be something simple, just temporary medical care. But what I experienced in that hospital went far beyond medicines and tests. It was a cruel mirror of the loneliness I never imagined I'd face. For days I anxiously awaited a visit, a call, a sign that I still mattered, and silence was my only companion. It was in the depths of that abandonment that something inside me awakened. Between suppressed tears and forgotten gestures, I rediscovered my own voice and planted the first seeds of a turning point that would change everything. Today I can say that I am stronger, more lucid, and above all free to write my own story. If you've ever felt invisible or discarded, know that this story is for you. I'm so happy to have you here. Follow my journey to the end and comment from which city you're watching. I want to know how far my story has reached. I woke to the muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor, and the soft light filtered through the white curtain. My lungs still burned, but the worst of the pneumonia seemed to have passed. I was alive, lucid, and that was reason enough to be grateful. My thoughts immediately raced to Brian. He had promised he would be here when I woke up. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past 9. I sat up, propped against the pillows, waiting to hear his voice at any moment. I imagined Thomas's smile hurrying into the room, perhaps with flowers, or one of those children's drawings he used to make for me years ago. I tried to remember if he said he would come today or yesterday, but my mind was still hazy from the medication. I pressed the call button to ask the nurse if anyone had arrived. She said no, but that it might just be a matter of time. That silly hope sustained me. Maybe traffic was bad, or he was late for a meeting. Brian was always very busy, and I understood. I always understood. But this time I needed him. I just wanted a familiar face to remind me that I still belong somewhere. While I waited, I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the sound seemed distant, as if my mind was too focused on the closed door. Every noise in the corridor made my eyes dart towards the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. But it remained still, cold, silent. The lunch tray arrived and I didn't notice. My appetite didn't either. It must have just been a delay, right? The hours dragged on, one after another, as if time wanted to remind me of something I stubbornly ignored. The room became quieter than it should have been. No routine noise from other patients, no familiar voices in the corridor calling my name. Just silence, interspersed with the beeping of machines and the footsteps of the nursing staff. I started watching the cell phone beside the bed. No notifications, no messages. No missed calls. Did they have the right number? Maybe the reception had made a mistake. But no, Brian knew where I was. He had authorized the admission himself. He had all the details. I began to recall times when, no matter how small the problem, I would drop everything to rush to their side. Fevers, school fights, sleepless nights because of nightmares. I was always there. My chest tightened with the realization that perhaps all that presence had only mattered as long as I was useful, as long as I was necessary. I looked at the door again. The same stillness. The artificial flower arrangement on the dresser seemed to mock my emptiness. I got up with effort, walked to the window and stared at the world outside. Out there life went on. And here it was as if I had been paused, forgotten. Did they forget about me? The next day, early in the morning, a nurse came in with a medical chart in her hands and a hesitant expression. "Mrs. Helen, you're discharged. You can go home today." A wave of relief washed over me, as if I was finally going to leave that limbo. I smiled and started tidying my things. "My son should be here any moment," I commented, almost apologetically. She hesitated. The nurse consulted her clipboard again and said gently, "We have no record of visits or contact in the last few days." I froze. "What do you mean?" He knew I was being discharged today. She tried to hide her discomfort with a polite smile and said that perhaps he would still show up, but that, by protocol, I would have to wait in the common ward until someone came to pick me up. My throat closed up. I sat down slowly, trying to process that information. I called Brian, but it went to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. My heart felt like it weighed tons, and every second passed with cruel slowness. I started to wonder if I had done something wrong. If I had said something that pushed him away. But how? All I did was care. The nurse placed her hand on my shoulder, a brief but comforting gesture. "We'll take you to a common ward, okay? That way you can rest better while you wait." I nodded with a lump in my throat. None of them would come. I was alone. I felt an emptiness that no medication could fill. The new ward was less quiet, but much more impersonal. I shared the space with 3 other ladies, all at different stages of recovery, each with her story, her pain, her silence. My bed was the last one, near the window. From there, I could see the patio where visitors gathered. But no one was there for me. With every approaching sound of wheels, with every whispered announcement of names by a nurse, I held my breath. I hoped to hear mine. I hoped to see Brian with that disconcerted smile, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that his phone fell in the water, that he was stuck at work. Anything but absence. The hours dragged on again. I watched a patient receive a smiling granddaughter with flowers. Another received a tight hug from an affectionate daughter. I smiled discreetly, without envy but with longing. It was like watching a movie about the life I thought I had. A life that perhaps never really existed. I tried to distract myself with a book a nurse offered me. I read the same page 4 times. The words danced, confused, while my chest tightened. The hospital was large, but I had never felt so small. With every door that opened, I held my breath. Dr. Andrew walked through the ward with his serene and attentive manner. He was young, but with a gaze that seemed to carry decades of listening. When he stopped beside my bed, he smiled kindly and asked how I was feeling. I replied with a vague gesture. He then sat in the chair beside me and remained silent for a few seconds. "I noticed you're still here, even after being discharged," he commented softly. I nodded, unable to hide my sadness. I explained in restrained words that my son hadn't come yet. He slightly frowned and asked if he could call someone for me. I thanked him but refused. I didn't want to seem weak. "It's not weakness to feel alone, Mrs. Helen," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "It's human. And no one should leave the hospital like this." His words, spoken gently, made me hold back tears. For the first time since I woke up in that hospital, someone truly seemed to care. Dr. Andrew promised to follow my case until I was safe. "We'll make sure you don't stay here indefinitely," he said. Those words, though simple, gave me something rare at that moment: dignity. He seemed more worried than my own son. I took a deep breath and looked for Elaine's number in my phone's address book. I didn't want to worry her, but I no longer knew what else to do. I waited 4 rings before her lively voice answered on the other end. "Helen. Finally, how are you?" I swallowed my emotions. "Hi, dear. I need a favor. Just a small favor." I told her everything in a few words. I said I was fine, but that no one had come to pick me up. She fell silent for a moment, which was rare for her. "I'm grabbing my keys now. Don't worry, I'm on my way." The knot in my throat dissolved into a sigh. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The thought that someone still cared about me was almost a balm. I knew Elaine had always been loyal, but I didn't expect her to drop everything so quickly. I felt warmth in my chest, a spark of hope that seemed extinguished until then. It wasn't my family, but it was love. While waiting, I watched the nurse rearranging the sheets of the patient next to me. She looked at me and smiled. I smiled back with watery eyes. In that hospital full of strangers, a simple gesture was enough to remind me that kindness still existed in the world. She promised to come. But would it be enough? The drive home was silent. Elaine drove carefully, casting worried glances from time to time, but I averted my eyes. I still couldn't organize my feelings. The wound of abandonment was too open to be shared. I pretended to be tired, which wasn't a lie. My body hurt less than my soul, but both were exhausted. Upon arriving, I found my house the same, but strangely distant. It was as if I had returned to a place where I no longer fit. I sat on the living room sofa, listening to the same familiar sounds: the ticking of the clock, the wind in the windows, the creaks of the old floorboards. Everything said that this was my home, and yet I felt like an intruder. Elaine prepared tea and sat with me in silence, respecting my time. Pretending normality was my choice. Disguising the pain, hiding the fear, silencing the loneliness. It was easier to smile and say everything was fine than to dive into the murky waters that still drowned me inside. Every memory of the hospital arose like a wave, threatening to drag me back. But I was determined not to be a victim. I just needed a decision. When Elaine left, I closed the door carefully and took a deep breath. Alone in the room, I looked at the photo of my deceased husband on the shelf. A thought crossed my mind with unexpected force. It was time to seek answers. Not about the past, but about what remained for me. Pretending everything was fine was easier than explaining. The next morning, I put on my best clothes and looked up William Brooks' number in my old address book, the lawyer who had handled my husband's estate. George and I had always trusted him. He knew things that even I didn't fully understand at the time. I hesitated for a moment before dialing. It felt strange to ask for help without knowing exactly what I wanted. The call was answered quickly. William's voice sounded warm and respectful as always. I explained in broad strokes that I needed to better understand some old documents, and he offered to see me that very afternoon. "Come calmly, Helen. I'm available." There was something comforting in knowing that someone still treated me with dignity. During the drive to the office, my mind filled with confused memories. George never talked much about inheritance. Everything always seemed simple, straightforward. But now, after all I had been through, I needed to understand what belonged to me, and what I could protect. For the first time, the idea of security sounded like something I should ensure myself, not expect from others. William greeted me with a gentle smile and a light hug. We sat in the book-lined room, and he listened attentively, without interrupting me. At the end of my story, he leaned slightly forward and said with a firmer voice, "Perhaps it's time for you to know the details they never told you. You have more than you imagine, Helen." William stood up and opened one of the drawers of the large filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder with documents that looked old but well organized. "Your husband left very specific clauses in his will, some protected by confidentiality until certain conditions were met." My eyes narrowed. "And those conditions, were they met?" He nodded calmly. As he explained, I realized that George had been much more foresight than I thought. There were funds held in my name, properties, and silent investments. But the most impactful was the clause that stated if I were deemed abandoned or neglected by my direct family, I would have exclusive power to redistribute the inheritance. My hands trembled. "He always said you took care of everyone. He wanted to make sure you were never at anyone's mercy," William said, with tenderness in his eyes. I didn't know whether to cry from relief or indignation. All of that could have made a difference days ago. But now perhaps it was my turning point. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. I still had something they didn't know. And more than that, I had the chance to decide. For the first time in a long time, control was in my hands. Now you have the power to decide what they deserve. 2 days later, Brian appeared. He walked through the door like someone returning from a long, tiring trip, with a bouquet of flowers in his hands and a rehearsed smile on his face. "Mom, I missed you so much. Sorry I didn't come sooner. Everything was so hectic." The excuse shattered like glass on the floor. I looked at him in silence and my heart tightened, not from emotion, but from realizing the irreversible distance. He sat on the couch, complimented my appearance, and commented on how the house seemed as cozy as ever. It was as if nothing had happened. No mention of the hospital, no genuine apology. Just ready-made phrases, strategic pauses, as if he were dealing with a client, not his mother. The flowers, I noticed, still had the price tag on the wrapping. I spoke with him as if everything was fine. Not because it was, but because I needed to observe. Every word, every gesture. The man before me didn't seem like the son I had held in my arms. It was someone who reappeared with a memorized script, like someone trying to correct a mistake with an empty compliment. Still, I let him speak. He asked how I was and if I needed anything. I shook my head with a slight smile. "I'm fine, thank you." He smiled back, and for a moment I wondered if he even believed what he was saying. Was it affection? Or convenience? The next day Melissa came. Always impeccable, with that calculated look and a voice too sweet to be sincere. "Helen, dear. I've been thinking about you so much. We need to talk about your next steps." She offered me a colorful catalog of senior living residences, describing each one as if they were 5-star hotels. Her enthusiasm was disconcerting. Imagine waking up every day with activities, a pool, afternoon tea, without having to worry about anything. I nodded politely, but my mind screamed. I had never wondered before how someone could turn abandonment into a marketing proposal. She spoke as if she were giving me a gift. But what I saw was a push. Melissa always liked control. And now she seemed determined to turn my life into a showcase. Brian, and I think it would be good for you. A place with people your age, you know? That sounded like code for away from us. The idea of being cared for seemed more like being discarded, as long as it was done with flowers and promises of yoga. I put the catalog away without saying anything. I thanked her with a polite smile. I had understood everything. This wasn't concern. It was calculation. She talked about nursing homes as if they were resorts. At the end of that week, I asked to speak with William again. I recounted everything that had happened, every word, every visit. He listened patiently, noting important passages. When I finished, he pulled an envelope from his folder and placed it before me. They found out about the inheritance, Helen. That's why they reappeared. My heart broke once more, as if every effort to protect myself crumbled with the confirmation. We had unusual movements in old records, requests for copies, attempts to consult. Someone alerted them. The mask had finally fallen. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't affection. It was pure interest. Indignation filled me completely, but also a strange kind of clarity. I finally had all the pieces of the puzzle. None of this was about me as a person, but as an heiress. My value was measured by what I possessed, not by what I was nor by what I felt. I looked at William and smiled bitterly. Now everything makes sense. He nodded and added with regret, but maybe it's too late for them. And for the first time I agreed. Now everything made sense. Too late. Thomas arrived unannounced, with a crumpled jacket and a face marked by what seemed like guilt. When I opened the door, for a moment I hesitated, fearing it was another rehearsed visit. But his eyes were sincere, there was truth there. He hugged me tightly, as if he hadn't seen me in years. And when he let me go, his eyes scanned me like someone looking for cracks in a once precious vase. We sat in the living room and talked about trivialities for a few minutes. But he soon interrupted the conversation, looking at me seriously. Grandma, why do you look so sad? I couldn't lie, but I also couldn't open up completely. I looked away and just said I was tired, that age was taking its toll. But my grandson was more observant than I imagined. He knew something wasn't right. I offered tea, trying to change the subject, but he kept watching me. Thomas had always been sensitive, and now he seemed more man than boy. I realized he missed his real grandmother, not the one who smiled out of obligation. And that touched me in a way I didn't expect. He placed his hand over mine and said, "If you want to talk, I'm here." I smiled more with my eyes than with my mouth. There was still love in the world, and he was there before me with sincere eyes and willing ears. Grandma, why do you look so sad? I spoke little but enough. I told him I had been in the hospital, and that I stayed there longer than I should have. I said that for days I waited for someone, and no one came. He widened his eyes, surprised, as if that were impossible. My dad said everything was fine. He murmured, confused. I shook my head gently without accusing, but letting the silence say what words could not. Thomas listened attentively, his hands clasped and his eyes teary. When I finished, he hugged me again, and I felt something between us strengthen. As if, in the midst of the adult's lies, there was still a pure truth between grandmother and grandson. We then talked about good memories and laughed together, relieving the burden on my soul. For the first time in weeks I felt seen. With you I still feel like a person, I confessed without thinking. He looked at me surprised and squeezed my hand tighter. You're the best person I know, Grandma. That hit me deeply. Maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild some part of myself. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I imagined. To hear from someone that I still mattered was more potent than any painkiller. It was the kind of affection that cannot be bought, faked, or forced. It was love. With you I still feel like a person. We were still talking when I heard the door open firmly. Melissa entered with determined steps and icy eyes. Upon seeing Thomas there with me, her face quickly changed. Son, I thought you were studying. He slowly stood up, looking guilty for something he didn't know was wrong. I wanted to visit Grandma. She's a bit sad. Melissa's gaze landed on me like a blade. Dear, we need to talk. Now, she said with a forced smile, taking him by the arm. Thomas hesitated, looked at me as if asking permission. I nodded with a discreet gesture. even though my chest tightened. I knew she didn't want him to hear anything else. And worse, I feared what she would say to push him away from me. She quickly let him out. I stood in the hallway, feeling the echo of their receding footsteps. The air suddenly felt heavier, as if the truth was being deliberately pushed away. They don't want him to know the truth. The next day Thomas returned but didn't come straight in. He stood in the backyard for a few minutes, observing the house as if it held answers. It was then that I heard footsteps upstairs and recognized Brian and Melissa's voices in an agitated tone. Thomas heard too. By instinct, he approached the stairs, climbing without being noticed. I merely watched from the kitchen, unsure whether I should stop him or allow it. He stopped near the half-open office door, where the two were arguing. The words came out forcefully, laden with frustration. "She won't last long. Her age is already weighing on her. And when she's gone, all of this will be ours." Melissa responded something inaudible, but the tone of voice left no doubt. They were waiting for the end as if it were a relief. Thomas covered his mouth with his hand, shocked, motionless. He heard more than he should have. Or rather, he heard exactly what he needed to wake up. These were not worried parents. They were impatient heirs. At that instant, an irreversible crack appeared in the image he had of his own family. The boy who visited me had vanished. The one who descended the stairs was a young man with wounded eyes. When he found me in the kitchen, his face was pale. But he said nothing. He just hugged me tightly, as if he wanted to apologize for something that wasn't his fault. "She won't last long. And then the house is ours." That same night, Thomas confronted his parents. The argument was intense, filled with disappointment. "Are you really waiting for Grandma to die to get the house?" he shouted, his voice trembling. Brian tried to calm him, saying everything had been taken out of context. Melissa tried to make a joke of it, but it was too late. What was said could not be unsaid. The damage was already done. "Is this what you call family?" he asked, his eyes watery. Neither of them responded. The silence was the loudest answer. Thomas left the living room and went up to his room, locking the door. I heard everything from a distance without intervening. It hurt to hear, but it also gave me a strange kind of relief. Finally, someone besides me saw the truth. That night was long. The silence within the house's walls seemed to have a life of its own. I retired early, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay staring at the ceiling, remembering all the times I defended those two, even with clear signs of contempt. Now there was no denying it. Something had changed. And that change wouldn't come from them. It would have to come from me. "Is this what you call family?" The next morning, I sat by the window and made a list. Small but significant. It was a list of everything that could still be mine, not in possessions but in decisions. The conversation between Brian and Melissa didn't surprise me as much as it pushed me out of passivity. I didn't want to live at anyone's convenience. And I definitely didn't want to pass away as a shadow in their memory. I called William and asked him to update the documents he had mentioned. I want to think calmly but act firmly. He understood immediately. There was a mix of respect and urgency in his voice. For the first time, it wasn't him offering solutions, it was me dictating the terms. And that made all the difference. The loneliness was still here, but now it was accompanied by a new element. Purpose. I had something to do. Something that no longer depended on fake hugs or empty promises. The Helen who kept silent was being left behind. The one who planned was different. And this time no one would stop me from writing my own ending. They think they have control. But I have something better: choices. I sat before William with a conviction he hadn't seen before. I no longer wanted to postpone decisions, nor live in the shadow of fear. "Are you ready to proceed with the changes?" he asked. I nodded firmly. I want to leave a legacy, but only for those who truly love me. This time my voice didn't tremble. We discussed clauses, possibilities, names. I asked him to include clear protections, preventing any future challenges from taking hold. William was precise, and for the first time I realized how the law could also be an instrument of emotional justice. Each of my signatures was a liberation from everything I had been forced to endure in silence. The final document represented not only my assets but my story. After signing, I started to feel different. As if something was finally aligning within me. William looked at me with contained pride. George would be pleased to see you like this. I smiled, not with longing but with recognition. Finally, I was living for myself. And that was liberating. I want to leave a legacy, but only for those who truly love me. I began to act subtly. Some donations to local institutions that cared for the elderly. A small scholarship in George's name but with values only I knew. I anonymously sent flowers to other patients at the hospital where I had been. Small gestures that no one would understand, but that made perfect sense to me. I told Brian or Melissa nothing. Not out of revenge, but out of respect for my own peace. Every time I donated something, I felt the weight of dependence decrease. It was as if I was redefining the contours of my worth, without waiting for them to recognize it. Thomas was the only one to notice my growing lightness. Discreetly, I also began to test my autonomy at home. I redecorated the guest room, organized the closets, selected books I wanted to reread. Life once again had color and direction. I no longer waited for promises, now I created my own certainties. And the more I gave, the more whole I felt. Every penny given was a drop of freedom. I told Elaine everything one Sunday afternoon, while we had tea in the garden. She listened with that attentive gaze and open heart that only she possesses. "You've changed so much, Helen. You even look younger." We laughed together like in the old days. When I spoke about the changes in the will, she simply held my hand. "Now only one thing is missing," she said. She suggested I gather the family once more. Not for them but for you. To close this cycle with dignity. The idea initially bothered me. So many poorly healed wounds, would it be worth it? But as the afternoon passed, I began to feel that perhaps it was necessary. An emotional farewell not to life but to everything I once was. She offered to help me with the invitations, the menu, the details. Everything simple but meaningful. "We'll do it your way," she said. And that's how I decided. It's time for everyone to hear what I have to say. I sent the invitations calmly, one by one. Each word carefully written like someone tracing the outlines of a final piece. "Family dinner in memory of George," the card read. Brian responded almost immediately. Melissa was cordial. Thomas with sincere joy. The dining room was arranged with discreet flowers and a table set with my favorite china. Everything suggested reconciliation. Upon arrival, they greeted each other with rehearsed gestures. Brian hugged me with a contained smile. Melissa complimented the decor, but her eyes were too attentive. I sat at the head of the table, as I used to do when George was still with us. The atmosphere was like a slow-motion movie, full of disguised tension. "What does she want now?" they whispered among themselves, thinking I wouldn't hear. I gave a brief speech talking about longing time, family. I observed the faces at the table. Thomas listened to me with emotion. Melissa smiled with her lips, not her eyes. Brian seemed to calculate everything. Food was served but almost no one ate. They were waiting for something. Perhaps a declaration. Perhaps a promise. But that was not what I had in store for that night. I knew they were there for different interests, but I also knew that my voice would have more weight than any inheritance. It was time to use it. "What does she want now?" they whispered. Between courses, smiles faded. The dinner continued like a silent play, and every word was measured. Thomas looked at me with expectation, as if he already knew what was coming. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked in a low voice, and I just nodded with an affectionate look. But he kept watching me like someone reading between the lines. Melissa started suggesting plans for the future, talking about stability and care. Brian interrupted her to mention investments and ideas for preserving the patrimony. That hurt me, but it no longer affected me as before. There was no more illusion. What existed now was discernment, and it gave me serenity. Gradually, I noticed that Thomas was no longer smiling. His furrowed brow revealed that he understood more than he let on. He held my hand under the table, as if anchoring me there, in the midst of that whirlpool. I took a deep breath, looked around, and knew the moment had come. I no longer needed to wait for their permission to be heard. I raised my glass for a toast, and with the glass held high, I let the truth flow out. Thomas watched me in silence as if he knew. I looked at each of them for a few seconds before speaking. "I want to thank you for being here. Tonight is special, not just in memory of George, but because it marks a new beginning." Melissa frowned. Brian raised an eyebrow. Thomas lightly squeezed my hand. I've updated my will, I announced clearly. The air seemed to disappear from the room. Melissa dropped her cutlery. Brian crossed his arms, visibly tense. Now things are as they should be. Fair. Consistent with the truth of what I have lived. I explained that all my assets had been redistributed. I spoke of emotional criteria, of presence, of respect. The silence was so dense that I could hear each person's breathing. I looked at Thomas with tenderness. Some choices are simple when we remember who was with us during difficult times. Brian tried to interrupt, but I continued. Don't worry. You will know the details soon officially. Then I sat back down and took a sip of wine. For the first time I tasted freedom. Not all of you are included. 2 days after dinner, Brian showed up at my house unannounced. His face was tense, his hands trembling, his eyes red with anger. You can't do this, Mother, he shouted as soon as I walked through the living room door. All of this is rightfully mine. He had consulted a lawyer and decided to contest the new will. His voice, once calm, was now pure fury. I tried to remain serene, but every word he spoke cut deep. You let emotion get to you. This is unfair, he said, as if I were a child without discernment. I didn't respond immediately. I let him finish his monologue of accusations and indignation. Deep down, what he couldn't accept was no longer having control. He slammed the door shut as he left, leaving a trail of legal threats. I took a deep breath, sat on the sofa, and faced the silence of the house. A silence that, this time, did not frighten me. I knew what was coming. And I knew I wasn't alone. I won't let her take what's mine. The next day I met William at his office. Without rushing, he offered me tea and opened a folder. Helen George foresaw this kind of reaction. And he left everything prepared. Calmly, he showed me a specific clause in the old will. In case of contestation by any heir, that heir would be automatically excluded from the inheritance. It was simple. Irrefutable. I remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing the weight of that invisible protection George had left. He wanted to ensure you were respected until the end, even in his absence. My heart tightened, not from pain but from gratitude. For the first time, I felt that my deceased husband had truly seen me. William placed his hand on the paper and said, You are supported. I knew at that moment that I no longer needed to fight. The battle had already been won in the past, with foresight and affection. Justice didn't just come from the courts. It came from intention, memory, loyalty. And there, before that clause, I was sure that the most valuable victory was having resisted. Justice is on the side of those who love, not those who expect an inheritance. I organized a new dinner, more intimate. Just me, Elaine, Thomas, and, at my insistence, Brian and Melissa. The table was smaller, but the atmosphere even denser. Before dessert, I stood up and took a letter from my pocket. I wrote this for you, and I asked that you listen to me until the end. Everyone was silent. The paper trembled a little in my hands, but my voice was firm. For years I served with love. I was a mother, wife, grandmother. I was present even when no one asked. But the moment I needed it, I was forgotten. The words sounded like both confession and judgment. Melissa looked away. Brian remained motionless. Thomas, with watery eyes, held my hand under the table. I continued. I am not writing this to blame. I am writing to liberate myself and you. I chose what is fair, not what is convenient. And I no longer expect understanding, only peace. When I finished, I carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. This is my farewell to pain, but not to life. I forgive you, but I will no longer forget myself. The next day, Melissa packed her bags without saying a word. She looked at me one last time before crossing the door. There was no drama, no speech, just the shadow of what could have been. Brian stayed, but he wasn't the same. He spent hours in his room, avoiding glances, avoiding himself. His silence was now a reflection of what he planted in me. It was a heavy silence full of remorse. And for the first time I felt he was beginning to understand. Now he knew the emptiness he left me with in the hospital. Now he heard the echo of doors that never opened. I didn't hate him, but I also no longer had room to console him. My cycle with him had changed its form. I wouldn't kick him out, but I wouldn't wait for him either. I was at peace with that. and that alone was enough. Now he knew the silence he left me with in the hospital. Thomas stayed nearby. He helped in the garden, ran errands, read to me at night. He brought lightness with his presence, and with him the days stopped being repetitive. Grandma, I don't need an inheritance. I just want to see you happy. His words touched me more than any will. With him, I learned that true love is simple and silently constant. We started a small project together, renovating the community library. He organized the books and I cataloged the donations. Sometimes we laughed at old titles no one read anymore. Other times we just sat on the park bench and watched the leaves fall. Time began to have a different rhythm. Thomas brought me the certainty that love can survive the selfishness of others. He owed me nothing, but he offered me everything. I don't need an inheritance, Grandma. I just want to see you happy. Over time, I learned to inhabit silence without it hurting me. I started walking alone, preparing my meals with pleasure, writing letters that would never be sent. One day, I sat down at the old desk and began a different letter. In it, I wrote everything I felt, for the girl I was, for the woman I became, for the elderly woman who was reborn. It was a farewell, but not to people. It was to pain, to the need for acceptance, to dependence disguised as love. There, with a steady pen, I wrote my own liberation. And when I finished, I felt as if I had lived a new life in a few pages. This time, I was the one writing my ending. With tenderness, with clarity, with courage. Pain didn't define me. It liberated me. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you ever experienced anything similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.